The moment Clarence Rourke slammed his fist down on the long oak table, every man in the bunkhouse went silent. "She is not leaving," he said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than any shout. "Not tonight. Not ever. And any man who has a problem with that can ride off my land before sunrise." Esther Covington stood in the doorway of the cookhouse, her hands still dusted with flour, her dark eyes wide as she took in the scene. 6 ranch hands sat frozen around the table, staring at the man who signed their wages, the man who had never once raised his voice in the 2 months she had known him, and she felt something crack open deep in her chest. Because Clarence Rourke was defending her, not her cooking, not her usefulness, her. And she had spent the last 3 weeks preparing herself to leave. The accusation that had started it all still hung in the air like smoke. Elroy Pitch, the oldest of the ranch hands, had called her a liar in front of everyone, had said she was hiding something dark, that she had come to the Double R Ranch under false pretenses, that she was trouble wrapped in a flower apron, and that Clarence Rourke was too stubborn or too smitten to see what everyone else could plainly see. He had said the word smitten like it was a disease. Clarence had gone very still when he heard it, not angry still. Something deeper than anger, something that looked, from where Esther stood, like a man finally hearing something he had already known and had been refusing to name. She took one step back toward the shadows of the doorway, intending to disappear, intending to pack her single carpet bag and be gone before dawn, because she had learned long ago that when men started fighting over you, you were usually the one who ended up losing everything. But Clarence turned and looked directly at her. And the expression on his face stopped her feet as surely as iron shackles. It was not pity. It was not the protective fury of a man preserving property. It was something raw and unguarded, something that said, plain as the Texas sky, that he had already made up his mind about her and no accusation in the world was going to change it. "Esther," he said quietly, "come sit down." She had been hired to cook. He had pulled out a chair at the head of his own table and asked her to sit beside him. Everything in her life had been leading to this impossible, terrifying moment, and she had no idea how to survive it. To understand how they arrived at that evening, you have to go back to the first day of October in 1883, in the hill country of West Texas, where the land was dry as a bone and beautiful as a hymn, and where a woman traveling alone was either very brave or very desperate. Esther Covington was both. She had been born in 1858 in Galveston, the daughter of a Methodist minister who had believed with his whole heart that the Lord rewarded the faithful with prosperity. He had been wrong, but he had died believing it, which was perhaps a mercy. Her mother had followed him into the grave when Esther was 19, leaving her with a small house on a small lot that the bank had already begun to circle like a patient vulture. She had sold what she could, kept what she needed, and moved inland, following work the way a river follows gravity, because there was no other direction available to her. She had cooked in a hotel in San Antonio for 2 years, learning how to stretch $1 into a week's worth of meals, learning how to make cornbread that tasted like luxury, learning how to feed hungry, difficult men who would complain about anything and tip for nothing. She had been good at it. She had been so good at it that the hotel owner's wife had grown suspicious, and Esther had moved on before the situation could become what it looked like it was becoming. She had cooked in a boarding house in Fredericksburg after that, and things had been quiet and decent there, until the owner had died and his son had taken over, and the son had ideas about what a woman working in his establishment owed him that Esther did not share. She had left before dawn on a Tuesday with her carpet bag, her mother's iron skillet, and a dark past that she was determined to keep behind her. She had been traveling for 3 days when she saw the notice nailed to the post at the general store in the small town of Dillard Crossing. It was written in a careful, deliberate hand, not the hand of a man used to writing, but of a man who understood the importance of being precise. Cook wanted. Double R Ranch, 12 miles south of Dillard Crossing on the Pecos Road. 8 men to feed, 3 meals daily, fair wages, private quarters. References preferred but not required if the work speaks for itself. Ask for C. Rourke. She had read it 3 times. Fair wages, private quarters, references preferred but not required. That last part was what did it. Because Esther Covington had references, they were simply the kind she could not present without explaining things she preferred not to explain. She had asked the general store owner for directions, borrowed a horse from the livery on the promise of wages to come, and ridden out into the dry October hills toward the Double R Ranch, her heart hammering with something caught between hope and desperation. The ranch had appeared around a bend in the road like something from a different story than the one she had been living. It was not grand, not by any standard she might have imagined, but it was solid and well-tended in a way that spoke of genuine care rather than wealth. The main house was 2 stories of pale limestone, built low and wide to deal with the Texas heat. The bunkhouse sat at a respectful distance, flanked by a cookhouse with a stone chimney. There were cattle in the distant fields, a proper stable, a vegetable garden gone dry at the end of season but with the evidence of serious tending still visible in the orderly rows. She had straightened her back, smoothed her dress, and knocked on the front door of the main house. Clarence Rourke had opened it himself. She had expected someone older. The notice had the feel of an older man's writing, careful and measured. But the man who opened the door was somewhere around 32 or 33, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who spent his days outside and the quiet, assessing eyes of someone who spent his evenings thinking. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, not the kind of handsome that announced itself. He was built lean and straight, with calloused hands and a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and his eyes were a particular shade of green-gray that Esther had never encountered before, like the color of the hills in the last hour before a rainstorm. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "I am here about the cooking position," she said, before the silence could become something she had to explain. "I see that," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either, not yet. "You are traveling alone." "I am." Another pause. She held herself very still under the examination, not defiant, just steady, the way she had learned to be when being assessed by someone who held power over her immediate future. "Can you cook?" he asked. "I can cook better than anyone you have hired previously," she said. "If you have hired anyone previously. If you have not, I can cook better than anyone you are likely to find." She saw something flicker in those gray-green eyes. Not offense. Something closer to approval, like a man who appreciated directness and had not expected to find it there. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of the house was clean and spare. Not empty, not the way a house was empty when it had never been a home, but stripped down like a man who had once had more and had simplified on purpose. There was good furniture, a long oak dining table that could seat 12, bookshelves with actual books on them rather than just ornament, and a fireplace big enough to heat the whole ground floor. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the stone floors, no paintings on the walls, nothing decorative at all. She noticed that there was a single plate on the dining table, set at one end with a fork and a knife and nothing else. One setting. Every day, she would later learn. One man eating alone at a table built for 12. "The cookhouse is separate," he said, leading her toward the back of the house. "There is a room in the cookhouse where you can sleep. It is small but private. The men eat in the bunkhouse, but I take my meals here. You would cook for all of us, serve the men in the bunkhouse, and bring my meal to the house." "That is a standard arrangement," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "You have done this work before. In hotels and boarding houses." Different scale, but the same principles. "Why did you leave?" The question was quiet and direct, and she had been expecting it. "The first position ended when the establishment closed," she said. This was true. "The second ended due to a disagreement about the terms of employment." This was also true as far as it went. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was hearing not just her words but the spaces between them. "What is your name?" he asked. "Esther Covington." Clarence Rourke, he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely professional. "The wages are $12 a month," he said. "Plus room and the food you cook, which I expect you to eat yourself rather than going without, because I have had cooks before who treated their own nutrition as optional and it affected the work." She blinked at that. In 2 years of hotel cooking and 2 years of boarding house work, no employer had ever thought to specify that she should eat. "That is acceptable," she said carefully. "You can start in the morning if you like," he said. "Or today if you are hungry and want to get your bearings." She was hungry. She had been hungry for 2 days. Today, she said, the cookhouse was better equipped than she had dared hope. There was a large cast iron range, a proper woodpile, a well nearby, barrels of flour and cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, a root cellar with onions and potatoes. Someone had stocked it with care, which told her that whoever had done the ordering took feeding people seriously. She made supper that first night from what was available: a thick bean and pork stew, cornbread baked in her mother's iron skillet which she had unpacked first, before anything else, dried apple preserves that she found in the root cellar, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She carried Clarence Rourke's plate to the main house at 6 o'clock, knocked on the back door, and set it on the long oak table the way she had been instructed. He was already seated, reading a letter, and he looked up when she came in. "It smells remarkable," he said. "Thank you," she said, and turned to go. "The men in the bunkhouse have not had a cooked meal in 3 weeks," he said to her back. "The last cook left without notice. I appreciate you starting today." She paused at the door. Were the men difficult with him? Her, he said, and no. She had family trouble and needed to go home. There was no difficulty. She turned slightly. And the position before her. "He drank," Clarence said, without elaborating. She nodded and went back to the cookhouse to eat her own supper, which she did sitting at the small work table with her mother's skillet on the shelf above the range where she could see it, and she thought that this might, possibly, be a situation she could survive. She did not allow herself to think beyond surviving. She had learned that lesson. The first week was pure professional ground. She cooked, the men ate, and they were appreciative in the rough, inarticulate way of men who had been going without. Pitch, the senior ranch hand, was a leathery man of 50-something with suspicious eyes and no excess conversation. He ate her food without complaint, which she understood was the highest form of compliment available from him. The other hands, 6 men ranging from their early 20s to mid-40s, were generally decent, the way men are decent when they are being well fed. Clarence Rourke came to his table every evening at 6. He was there every morning at 6:30 for breakfast, which she brought to the house, and he took a midday meal when his work permitted it. He was always reading something. Ledgers, a battered copy of a book she eventually identified as David Copperfield. He thanked her for every meal with the same quiet precision. He never made demands beyond what was necessary, and never made her feel like hired help in the diminishing way that some men did. After the first week, on a Sunday afternoon when the men were resting and she had finished her cleaning, she was in the root cellar taking stock of the winter provisions when she heard someone coming down the short wooden steps. She turned, expecting one of the younger hands, and found Clarence instead, his hat in his hands, looking slightly out of place in his own root cellar. "I wanted to ask," he said, "whether there is anything you need that I have not provided." She looked at him. It was a thoughtful question. "Cinnamon," she said. "Dried chilies if you can get them, and I would appreciate a second set of mixing bowls. The single bowl makes certain things inconvenient." He was pulling a small notebook and pencil from his shirt pocket before she finished speaking, writing it down. "I will have someone ride to Dillard Crossing before the end of the week," he said. "Anything else?" she thought. "A new broom. The one in the cookhouse is losing its bristles." He wrote it down. "Done." He turned to go, then paused at the bottom of the steps. Without turning back, he said, "The food has been excellent, Miss Covington, every day. I want you to know that I have noticed." He went back up the steps before she could respond. She stood in the root cellar for a moment with the strange, unsteady feeling of someone who had just received something they did not know how to carry. By the third week, she had established a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. She was up at 5, the range lit and coffee on before any of the men stirred. Breakfast was biscuits, eggs when the hens cooperated, salt pork or bacon, and always coffee. The noon meal, when she could deliver it to the fields, was substantial and simple. Sandwiches of bread she baked herself, hard-boiled eggs, dried fruit. Supper was her most serious work. Stews, roasted meats when they slaughtered, cornbread, baked beans. Occasionally a pie when she had the fruit or the patience for it. She discovered, by listening and by paying attention, that Clarence Rourke's favorite was peach pie, which he ate without comment but with an expression of quiet and concentrated pleasure that was impossible to miss once you had seen it. She made peach pie twice in the third week, because she had found a good supply of preserved peaches in the cellar, and the second time she made it, she sliced an extra piece and put it on a separate plate with a cloth over it for herself, and she sat in the cookhouse after supper was cleared and ate it slowly, and thought that life could be worse. She had not, in that third week, allowed herself to think about Clarence Rourke as anything other than her employer. She had a strict rule about this, and she maintained it with the discipline of someone who understood the consequences of breaking it. He was a decent man who had hired her fairly and treated her with respect, and that was everything, and it was enough, and she was not going to complicate it by noticing things like the way his voice dropped very slightly when he said good night, or the way he had moved her chair back from the table when she had come to the kitchen door once to ask him a question, and he had instinctively risen to make space. She was not noticing those things. She was absolutely, firmly, professionally not noticing those things. It was in the fourth week that the first real conversation happened. She had come to collect his evening dishes and had found him at the table with a ledger open and a look on his face like a man doing arithmetic that was not coming out the right way. He had not heard her come in, which was unusual, and she had set the coffee down beside him before he registered her presence. He looked up with the startled expression of someone pulled out of deep water. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to startle you." "No," he said. "I was elsewhere." He looked back at the ledger, then closed it with the flat decisiveness of a man who had made up his mind to stop worrying about something for tonight. "Thank you for the coffee." She gathered the dishes. She should have left. "The North Herd," he said unexpectedly. "Do you know anything about cattle markets?" She turned. "Only what I have heard at tables I cooked for, which is perhaps more than you might expect." He looked at her steadily. "Sit down, Miss Covington, if you are willing." She hesitated for a single beat. Then she sat across from him at the long oak table, and he opened the ledger again, and he told her about the problem. The cattle prices had dropped sharply in the fall of 1883 due to overproduction in the northern markets, and his neighbor to the east, a man named Gerald Hatch, was pushing to sell the communal water rights to a land company out of Dallas that was expanding its holdings with the kind of aggressive, legal but ruthless strategy that had already swallowed 3 smaller ranches in the county. "If they get the water rights," he said, "I can run cattle on my land, but I cannot sustain them through a dry summer, which means eventually I sell." "And you will not sell," she said. It was not really a question. "I built this," he said quietly. "My father left me a quarter section of dirt and 1 good horse. I built the rest." No, she thought about it. She was not a businesswoman by training, but she had spent years cooking for men who talked business at the table, and she had a mind that held things and turned them over. "What is the land company's actual interest?" she asked. "Is it the cattle or is it the water itself?" He frowned slightly. "The water. There is talk of the railroad coming through. Water rights along the route would be enormously valuable to a railroad company. Then they will pay more for the water rights than any individual rancher," she said. "Which means that if you and your neighbors organized and negotiated collectively with the railroad rather than with the land company acting as a middleman, you might retain ownership of your land and still secure the income." Silence. Clarence Rourke looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. The hotels you worked in, he said carefully. Were any of them in major cities? San Antonio, she said. And I listened. Evidently, he said. She stood up because she had been sitting for 10 minutes at her employer's table, and she was acutely aware that it was 10 minutes more than she had been hired for. "Good night, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Good night, Miss Covington," he said. And then, as she was at the door, "Thank you for the conversation." She went back to the cookhouse and did not sleep for 2 hours. Something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, in the pressure of the air, in a quality of light that is not quite what it was. She had sat at his table and they had talked, not about work, not about food, not about the transaction between employer and employee. They had talked about something real, and he had listened to her. Not the way men listened when they were waiting for you to finish speaking, but the way a man listened when he intended to remember what you said. She told herself it meant nothing. She made the peach pie again the following Friday, and when she brought it to the house, he was standing at the window looking out at the hills with his back to her, and he turned when she came in, and the look on his face when he saw the pie was so unguarded and genuine and briefly happy that she had to look away before she did something foolish with her own expression. "You did not have to," he said. "It was not any trouble," she said. "The peaches are good this year, or they were, from the preserves. Someone put them up very carefully." "My mother," he said. Then, as if surprised by his own disclosure, "She died 4 years ago. I have been working through her preserves slowly. I cannot quite bring myself to replace them with store-bought." Esther set the pie down very carefully. "Then I will use what she put up with the same care she intended," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and it was the same 2 words he said every evening and every morning, but tonight they carried something entirely different in them. She left quickly, before either of them could say anything they would have to think about later. The trouble started in the 5th week, and it started with Elroy Pitch. Elroy had worked for the Double R for 11 years, longer than any other hand, longer than most of the outbuildings had been standing. He had a proprietary relationship with Clarence Rourke's affairs that fell just short of actually being Clarence's family, and he watched Esther with the particular suspicion of a man who had decided in advance that she was a problem. She had been careful with him. She had been warm, consistent, and professionally impeccable. She had never overstepped in the bunkhouse, never lingered where she was not necessary, never gave the men cause to wonder about her intentions. She was their cook. She was good at it. She minded her own business, but Elroy had started asking questions, not to her but around her. She heard him talking to the younger hands, heard her name spoken in a tone that made the back of her neck prickle. He was curious about why she had left her previous positions. He was curious about why a woman of her evident competence was traveling alone through West Texas in October without family or connections. He was particularly curious. She gathered from fragments she was not supposed to hear, about a story that had apparently circulated from Fredericksburg about a cook who had disappeared under circumstances that someone had found suspicious. The story, as Elroy had pieced it together, and was now circulating with the enthusiasm of a man who has found what he was looking for, was that the cook from Fredericksburg had been involved in something improper with the boarding house owner before his death, had perhaps taken things that were not hers when she left, and had disappeared before questions could be asked. The story was not entirely wrong in its facts, and was entirely wrong in its implications, and Esther Covington had been dreading something like it for weeks. The boarding house owner's son, the one who had replaced his father and developed the ideas about what she owed him, had apparently decided that the best defense was a strong offense. He had spread a version of events in which she was the one with the dark past, the hidden motive, the character that could not bear examination. It was a lie built on true details, the most dangerous kind. She heard enough of Elroy's conversations over 3 days to understand exactly what was coming, and she made up her mind with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had survived this before. She would pack her things. She would leave before the confrontation happened. She would not give the story a stage to play out on. She had her carpet bag halfway packed on the evening of the 6th week when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. She went to the cookhouse window and looked out. The main house door was open and light was spilling out of it, and she could hear Elroy Pitch's voice, low and insistent, and then Clarence Rourke's voice cutting across it, sharp in a way she had not heard from him before. She should not have gone. She knew she should not have gone. She went. She was at the cookhouse door when she heard Elroy say the word smitten. She was at the doorway of the bunkhouse without quite knowing how she had gotten there when she saw Clarence slam his fist on the table. And then Clarence was looking at her across the room with that expression, the one she had no defenses for, the one that said he had already decided. "Esther," he said, "come sit down." She stood in the doorway for 3 full heartbeats. Then she walked into the room and she sat down. The silence that followed was the kind that had a shape to it. Elroy Pitch was standing with his hat in his hands, and the other men were frozen at the table, and Clarence Rourke was looking at Elroy with a quiet that was the most dangerous thing Esther had seen in this peaceful ranch. "The story you heard came from Fredericksburg," Clarence said, not to Elroy specifically, to the room. "I know where it came from because I asked. 2 days ago when I first heard the whispers." A pause. "I wrote to the bank in Fredericksburg and to the minister there. I received their replies this afternoon." Esther went very still. "The boarding house owner died of a heart complaint that had been documented by a physician for 2 years, Clarence continued. His son, upon inheriting, behaved toward the female employees in a manner that the minister of that town described in writing as reprehensible. Miss Covington left without taking anything that was not hers, and several witnesses confirmed it. The son told a different story to cover his own conduct." The silence stretched. "That is what I know," Clarence said. "And I would have known it sooner if I had asked sooner, which I should have done when the first whisper reached me. That is my failure, and I am sorry for it." He was looking at Esther when he said the last sentence. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs under the table to keep them from shaking. Elroy cleared his throat. He was not a man given to apology, but he was also not a dishonest man, which meant that having been wrong was going to sit on him heavily. "I should have come to you before I talked," he said, not quite looking at Esther. "That is my failing. I was looking for trouble where there was none." "Yes," Clarence said simply, and then in a tone that closed the subject permanently, "Miss Covington is a member of this household. That will not be questioned again. Is that clear? A member of this household." Esther heard the phrase, and something in her chest did a very complicated and entirely unwelcome thing. The men went back to their suppers. Elroy did not look at her again that night, but the following morning he was the first one to clear his plate entirely and leave it neatly stacked by the cookhouse door, and she understood that this was his version of making peace. Clarence stayed at the table after the men dispersed. He was the only one left when Esther began gathering the serving bowls. She worked quietly, efficiently, not looking at him, because if she looked at him she was going to have to reckon with the fact that he had spent 2 days quietly investigating the story on her behalf without telling her he was doing it, without demanding an explanation from her first, without giving her the chance to defend herself, because apparently he had decided before the evidence that defense was not what she needed. "You knew," she said finally, not looking up from the table. "Before tonight." "You already knew. I suspected the truth for a week," he said. "I had confirmation this afternoon, and you said nothing to me. I did not want you to feel interrogated," he said. "You had not lied to me. You said your previous position ended due to a disagreement about the terms of employment. That is exactly what happened. You were not obligated to give me the full account, and I was not entitled to demand it." She stood up and looked at him directly. "Most employers would have considered themselves very entitled." "I am not most employers," he said quietly. She believed him. That was the dangerous part. She absolutely believed him. "I was going to leave," she said. "Tonight I had my bag half packed." Something moved across his face. "I know," he said. "That is why I handled it the way I did. If I had spoken to you first, you would have left before I had the chance to correct the record." She stared at him. You were protecting the record. I was protecting you, he said simply. Then he seemed to hear how that sounded and cleared his throat and looked at his coffee cup. Your position here, your reputation, which I am responsible for as your employer. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said softly. You do not need to thank me for basic decency, he said. That is not thanks worthy. That is just how things should be. She picked up the serving bowls and went back to the cookhouse. She did not unpack her carpet bag that night. She sat on her narrow cot and looked at it in the lamplight and had a very serious, very quiet conversation with herself about the difference between gratitude and something else entirely, and about the particular danger of a man who was genuinely good when you had spent years surrounded by men who were good in theory. She left the bag packed, but she did not leave. November came in with a cold front that swept down from the north and turned the hills gray and silver, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of the winter preparation that Esther found she understood instinctively. She began canning in earnest from the last of the garden stores, working 12 and 14-hour days in the warm cookhouse, while outside the wind pushed dead grass across the hardpan. She preserved tomatoes, green beans, corn, and anything else she could lay hands on, and she baked enough bread to feed an army, and she made the cookhouse smell like the best possible version of the world. Clarence Rourke appeared in the cookhouse doorway one gray afternoon in early November with his hat in his hand and a look of deliberate casualness that convinced her he had been standing outside working up to coming in. I thought, he said, that you might want company, if you are not too busy. She was elbow-deep in bread dough and completely occupied, and she said, There is coffee on the back of the range, without missing a beat. And he came in and poured himself coffee and settled onto the stool near the work table, and they talked for 2 hours about everything, except the things they were both actually thinking about. He told her about the cattle business, about the railroad negotiations he had begun with the neighboring ranchers following her suggestion, which had actually worked. An agreement had been reached that would give the ranch owners along the proposed route a leased water arrangement with the railroad that preserved their ownership and guaranteed their income. He told it like a man reporting facts, but she could see the satisfaction underneath it. She told him about Galveston, about the smell of the Gulf, and the way her father used to preach with his whole body like he was having an argument with God that he intended to win. She had not talked about her father in years. The words came out strangely, rusty with disuse and unexpectedly tender. He listened the way she had noticed he always listened, like she was saying something worth remembering. After that, the afternoon visits became a pattern, not every day, not formally arranged. But 2 or 3 times a week he would appear in the cookhouse doorway, and she would say, Coffee is on the back of the range. And he would come in, and they would talk. About books, because she had borrowed David Copperfield from his shelf with his permission, and they spent 3 weeks discussing it with the focused pleasure of 2 people who had perhaps not had many conversations about books before. About the land and the cattle and the small, specific beauty of the hill country in November, the way the cedar smelled after rain, the way the hawks rode the updrafts in the afternoon. About nothing and everything, the way you talk when you are trying very hard not to say the most important thing. She thought, in her most honest moments, that she might be falling in love with Clarence Rourke. And then she would think, in her most practical moments, that she was his cook and he was her employer, and she was 35 years old and had no business falling in love with anyone, and certainly not with a man who was being kind to her because he was a kind man, which did not mean what a foolish woman might make it mean. She stayed very firmly on the side of her practical mind. He made it very difficult. In mid-November, he arrived at the cookhouse on a Sunday morning when the other men had ridden into Dillard Crossing for supplies, and she was making a proper attempt at a pie crust, which she had managed to ruin twice already due to some flaw in her current flour, and she was in a state of concentrated frustration that she did not entirely hide when he appeared. He looked at the failed crusts. He looked at her expression. My mother used to add a spoonful of vinegar to the cold water, he said. When the lard was not quite right, she said it helped the texture. Esther looked at him. You watched your mother bake. I grew up in a small house with one room for living and working, he said. I watched everything. A spoonful of cider vinegar. She tried it. The third crust rolled out perfectly. She put the pie in the oven and turned around and found him still there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her, and the look on his face was the one she was not supposed to see, and he quickly rearranged it into something more neutral, but she had seen it, and she knew what it was, and her heart did something entirely reckless. Clarence, she said. He straightened. She very rarely used his given name, had been careful about it. I need you to tell me something honestly, she said, because she was her father's daughter after all, and she had inherited his willingness to argue with things that were bigger than her. All right, he said quietly. When you come here in the afternoons, she said, is it because you are checking on the work or because you want to be here? The silence was very long. I want to be here, he said. No qualification, no retreat. She gripped the edge of the work table. I am your cook, she said. And I have a history that is complicated even when the complications are not my fault. And I have no family connections and no property and no claim on. Esther, he said, and something in how he said it stopped her voice entirely. I have a ranch that I built out of a quarter section of dirt and one good horse. I have property and connections enough for two people. I'm not interested in what you came with. I am interested in who you are. She stared at him. I have been interested since you told me you could cook better than anyone I was likely to find, he said. Which turned out to be the truth, but I was interested before I knew that. That is a very short acquaintance, she said, though her voice was doing something unsteady. It is 6 weeks, he said. And I know you better than I have known anyone in 6 years of running this ranch and being too busy to know people properly. She said nothing. I'm not asking for anything, he said carefully. I understand that this is a complicated situation. You work for me, which is a complication. I just thought you deserved to know the truth, because I believe you have spent a long time among people who were not honest with you about their intentions, and I am not willing to be another one of those. She let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for several minutes. You are making this very difficult, she said. I know, he said, and she heard something almost self-deprecating in it. I am told I have a talent for complications. She looked at him steadily. And what do you intend to do about it? Nothing, he said, that you do not want me to do. She thought about the carpet bag, still half-packed on the floor of her cot room. She thought about Galveston and San Antonio and Fredericksburg and all the leaving she had done, all the survival, all the years of being very careful and very competent and very alone. There is a pie in the oven, she said finally. It will be ready in an hour. You could stay for it. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes. I would like that very much, he said. He stayed for the pie. He helped her carry the supper dishes to the main house afterward, which was not his job, and which made the younger hands stare with undisguised interest when they passed by the cookhouse. He said goodnight at the back door of the main house with a formality that was both respectful and slightly maddening. She went back to the cookhouse and sat on her cot and unpacked her carpet bag. December arrived, and with it the cold that made the hills look like iron etchings against a pale sky, and the ranch pulled inward the way things did in winter. The men less inclined to ride far, more inclined to mend harness and play cards in the bunkhouse, more grateful for the warm cookhouse and the excellent food. Elroy Pitch, in the way of men who had misjudged and knew it, had become quietly protective of Esther in the bunkhouse, keeping the younger men's conversation at a respectful temperature when she was nearby, which she appreciated without acknowledging, because acknowledging would embarrass him. The change between her and Clarence was not dramatic. It was slow and careful, and built from the same material their conversations had always been built from, except that now neither of them was pretending the foundation was only professional. He found reasons to be in the cookhouse more often. Not disruptively, not in ways that interfered with her work, but there he would be, on a cold afternoon, reading while she kneaded bread, occasionally looking up to say something or ask a question, occasionally falling silent for a long stretch in a way that felt entirely comfortable. She discovered that he played a battered harmonica badly and with enormous private enjoyment. She discovered that he had opinions about cattle breeds that were extensive and specific and fascinating to no one but himself, except that she found herself genuinely interested, because he talked about it with a quiet passion that was its own kind of handsome. She discovered that he had a dry, understated sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly and made her laugh in a way she had forgotten she was capable of. He discovered that she read faster than him and had sharper opinions about characters in novels than about almost anything else in her life. He discovered that she could do mathematical calculations in her head with startling speed, the result of years of managing kitchen budgets. He discovered that she was teaching herself Spanish from a dictionary she had found in the general store at Dillard Crossing, pronouncing things very correctly and with great concentration, because she believed in doing things properly or not at all. On Christmas Eve, which fell on a Monday in 1883, she made a dinner for the whole ranch household, not the usual separate arrangements. She set the long oak table in the main house for all of them, 8 ranch hands and Clarence Rourke, with mismatched candles from wherever she could find them and sprigs of cedar cut from the hills for decoration. She made roast beef and roasted potatoes and green beans from her own canning, and 3 kinds of bread and 2 pies and a molasses cake. She set the table and then went to the cookhouse to eat her own supper alone, because that was the arrangement, and because she did not know how to do anything else. She had been sitting at her work table for 10 minutes when she heard footsteps. Clarence Rourke appeared in the cookhouse doorway. He was dressed in a clean shirt that was not quite his Sunday best but was clearly the best he had put on in some time, and he was holding his hat. "The table is set for 9, he said. "There are 9 people on this ranch." She looked up at him. "You made the meal," he said. "You should eat it at the table." "I am the cook," she said softly. "You are a member of this household," he said, the exact words he had used weeks ago, except that this time they were freighted with something entirely different. "Come to the table, Esther." She looked at him for a long moment. She stood up and took off her apron. She smoothed her dress, which was not special but was clean, and she thought about the life she had been living, always one step outside the warmth, always on the other side of the glass, always feeding others from a distance, and telling herself it was enough. She walked with him across the yard to the main house. The men were already seated, and when she came in, Elroy Pitch stood up, which made the younger men scramble to their feet as well. The old courtesy awakened from somewhere, and she sat at the table, and the meal she had made was served and eaten together, all 9 of them, and it was possibly the best Christmas Eve she had ever had. After supper, after the men had drifted back to the bunkhouse with satisfied expressions and the table was cleared, Clarence built up the fire in the front room fireplace, and they sat on opposite ends of the long sofa with David Copperfield open between them, ostensibly trading passages back and forth, except that they had both stopped reading 20 minutes ago and were simply talking. "My mother used to say that a house needed a woman in it the way a fire needed air," he said, at some point. "I thought it was sentiment when she said it. I have been thinking about it more recently." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Esther said carefully. "She was practical," he said. "Which she would have considered a higher compliment. She would have liked you." Esther looked at the fire. "You cannot know that." "She valued competence and honesty and the willingness to speak plainly," he said. "I know that because those are the things I value and she is where I learned them. So yes, I can know that." Esther was quiet. "I have been trying to figure out," Clarence said, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words very precisely, "whether it is appropriate to tell you that I have not thought about anything except you for the last 6 weeks, or whether that is the sort of thing that puts you in an uncomfortable position given the nature of our arrangement." She turned and looked at him. "It does put me in an uncomfortable position," she said honestly. He nodded. "I thought so." "Because I am in the same position," she said. The fire crackled. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she thought about secrets and dark pasts and the hidden motives she had been accused of carrying. And she thought about how this man had written letters to clear her name before she had asked him to, had saved her a seat at his own table, had told her she was a member of his household with the certainty of someone who had already made up his mind. "I want to stay," she said. "Not as the cook, or not only as the cook. I want to stay," as she stopped because she was not sure what word came next. "As the person who is at this table," he said quietly. "Every evening, by right." She nodded, not quite trusting her voice. He reached across the sofa and covered her hand with his, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the fire burned low and steady, and outside the Texas hills were dark and cold and very quiet, and inside it was warm. January of 1884 brought the kind of cold that tested the limestone walls of the main house and kept the men close to the bunkhouse stove for days at a stretch. The ranch work went on regardless, cattle to be checked on, water troughs to be broken open in the mornings when they froze, but the pace of life contracted and there was more time in the evenings. Clarence and Esther had begun, in the quiet way of two people who have committed to each other without quite saying all the words yet, to exist in the same spaces more openly. She still maintained the cookhouse as her domain and her sleeping room there as her private space, because she was precise about the proper order of things, and he respected it entirely. But there was a change in how they moved around each other, a ease, a shared understanding that felt like something being built rather than something being denied. He told her, on a long cold evening in January, about the years before he built the double R, his early 20s spent working for other men, saving every dollar, sleeping in whatever bunkhouse would have him, learning cattle from men who were willing to teach and learning stubbornness from men who were not. He told her about buying the land, the quarter section his father had left him, and the particular loneliness of the first winter on it, just himself and the one good horse and no house yet, sleeping in a tent until he could cut stone. She told him things she had not told anyone. About the nights in San Antonio, when she had been so lonely, she had taken to cooking elaborate meals for herself in the hotel kitchen after the last service was done, just to have the comfort of something beautiful to eat. About the fear that had lived in her chest for the last year and a half, since Fredericksburg, the constant bracing for the next accusation, the next reason to leave, the exhaustion of running from a lie you could not disprove by standing still. "You can stand still here," he said. "Whatever comes." She believed him. He asked her, on a clear cold Saturday in late January, if she would like to ride out to the north pasture with him. He had to check on a section of fence, and it was a long ride through the best part of the country. She said yes, and they rode out together in the winter light, her on a steady bay mare from his stable, him on the big roan he preferred, and the hills were silver and gold in the January sun, and the air smelled of cedar and cold earth. They did not talk much. They did not need to. There was a particular comfort in being alongside someone whose silence felt like company rather than absence, and she was learning the particular quality of his quiet, which was never empty, always thinking. When they stopped to water the horses at the creek, he got down and helped her dismount with his hands at her waist, and they stood very close together for a moment looking at the cold running water, and he turned to her and kissed her with a directness and a gentleness that made her understand, finally and completely, that this was not a man with hidden motives or a trap being set. This was just a man who loved her. She put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not as steady as his expression, and she thought that perhaps she loved him too, with a certainty that felt different from anything she had previously mistaken for love. "I would like," she said carefully when they stepped apart, "for things to be proper." "So would I," he said immediately, and the speed of it made her want to smile because it meant he had been thinking about this. "I would need to write to my minister in Galveston," she said. "He married my parents, he would do the ceremony." "Write to him," Clarence said. "I will write to the circuit judge in Dillard Crossing. He can record it." She looked at him. "You are moving quickly." "I have been patient for 4 months," he said, and she did smile then because it was true, and because patience was not something she had associated with this kind of thing, but perhaps it should have been. They rode back to the ranch in the cold, golden afternoon, and that evening she wrote a letter to the Reverend James Horton of Galveston, Texas, informing him that Esther Covington intended to be married in the spring, and requesting his presence if he could manage the journey. She sealed the letter and sat with it in her hands for a moment. Then she put it on the tray for the morning post and went asleep more soundly than she had in years. February was cold and productive and full of small, warm things. She began learning the accounting books, not because he asked her to, but because she was curious and offered, and he handed them over with a look of such transparent relief that she understood he had been managing them badly and knew it. She reorganized the supply records, caught 3 instances where the Dillard Crossing General Store had been overcharging for goods that had a posted price, and renegotiated the winter feed arrangement with a neighboring rancher in a way that saved 2 months of wages. Clarence watched all of this with an expression that was equal parts admiration and amusement, and she found she did not mind being admired as long as it was for the right things. He came to her one February evening with a small carved wooden box he had made himself during the long winter evenings, the craftsmanship basic but the care evident in every joint. Inside was his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it. "It was her engagement ring," he said. "My father bought it from a jeweler in Austin before they were married. I would like you to have it if you are willing." She looked at the ring for a long moment. "I am willing," she said softly. He put it on her finger there in the cookhouse, by the light of the range, and it fit as if it had been made for her hand. The Reverend Horton wrote back in early March to say that he was old, and his traveling days were behind him, but that he had a colleague, a Reverend Whitmore, who did circuit ministry through West Texas, and would be passing through Dillard Crossing in April, and could perform the ceremony if they arranged it. They arranged it. Elray Pitch, when told, looked for a moment like a man who was experiencing several complex emotions simultaneously and had decided the correct response was dignity. "Congratulations," he said to both of them, formal and genuine. Then to Esther alone in a lower voice, "I am glad he has someone. He has been alone too long." "So have I," she said. He nodded once, as if that settled something that had been unsettled between them. The wedding was held on the 15th of April, 1884, in Dillard Crossing, in the small Methodist church that served the county. Esther wore a dress she had made from fabric ordered by mail from San Antonio, a deep blue wool that she had spent 6 weeks sewing in the evenings after the cooking was done, and she wore her dark hair pinned up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. There were no flowers in April in West Texas, but she had cedar sprigs, which smelled better than almost anything. Clarence wore his best suit, which was not elaborate but was well made and fit him properly, and when she walked down the short aisle toward him, he looked at her with an expression that she intended to remember for the rest of her life. Not overwhelmed, not surprised, but deeply, quietly certain. Like a man who had been waiting for something he was sure was coming, and here it finally was. The Reverend Whitmore was a small, energetic man who performed the ceremony with the practiced warmth of someone who had married a great many people in a great many circumstances and had never lost his feeling for the particular gravity of the moment. The vows were the traditional ones, nothing original, nothing fancy, and Esther said hers with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at Clarence's face. He said his with the same quiet precision he brought to everything important, looking at hers. All 7 of the Double R's ranch hands attended, in their cleanest shirts, plus the general store owner from Dillard Crossing, who had been the one to post her messages for 4 months, and felt a proprietary interest in the outcome, and a neighboring ranch family named Hollies who had come to know them both over the winter. After the ceremony, there was a meal in the church hall that Esther had cooked herself, which several people expressed surprise about and which she dismissed by pointing out that no one was going to cook her wedding meal better than she could. They drove back to the Double R in the late afternoon in the ranch wagon, the hills golden in the setting sun, the cedar perfuming the air, and Clarence held the reins with one hand and her hand with the other. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, as they turned onto the ranch road. She tried the weight of it. "It fits," she said. "It does," he agreed. The main house felt different when she walked into it that evening as its proper resident, not the cook coming to deliver supper, not the employee being invited in for a conversation. She stood in the front room and looked at the long oak table and the empty bookshelves that still held his books and the stone fireplace, and she thought about curtains and rugs and what she might do with this space that was now also hers. "What are you thinking?" he asked from behind her. "That the walls could use some color," she said. He looked at the walls. They were plain whitewashed limestone, which they had always been, and he had never thought about them particularly. "What color?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Something warm," she said. "I will figure it out." He put his hand on her shoulder, light and sure. "Figure anything you want," he said. "It is your house." Summer arrived in June with the particular intensity of the Texas hill country, dry heat and brilliant sun, and the cattle moving slow and dusty in the far pastures. The cookhouse continued to be Esther's primary domain during the days, though her role had evolved in ways that made the earlier arrangement feel like a small, preliminary chapter. She managed the household accounts now, officially and without question. She had expanded the kitchen garden beyond anything the Double R had previously attempted, adding rows of peppers and squash and herbs that she used in the cooking, and that gradually transformed the meals from very good to something the ranch hands discussed, with the animated wonder of men discovering that food could be more than fuel. She had ordered curtains, deep red wool that turned the front room firelight into something almost theatrical in the evenings. She had moved her mother's iron skillet from the cookhouse shelf to the kitchen in the main house, and she had hung it where she could see it from the doorway, and she had thought, with a fullness that threatened to be something embarrassing, that her mother would have understood this. In August, she suspected she was expecting their first child. She did not tell Clarence immediately. She turned the knowledge over in private for a week, the way she turned everything over from every angle, checking its solidity. Then she told him one evening after supper, with the directness that was her natural language, looking at his face. His expression went through several stages very quickly. Something like stunned, then something like afraid, then something that cleared into a joy so transparent and undefended that she reached across the table and took his hand because he looked for a moment like he might need something to hold. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly," she said. "I will see the doctor in Dillard Crossing next week." He pressed her hand between both of his. He did not say anything for a long moment. "I did not think," he said carefully, "that this was going to be the way my life went. When I was building this place, I thought it was going to be just the cattle and the land and the work. I did not let myself imagine more than that because wanting things and not having them was a particular kind of suffering I had decided to avoid." She watched his face. "I was wrong to think it could not be more," he said. "I was wrong about a lot of things." "You were not wrong about the cattle," she said softly. He laughed, and it was the surprised, genuine laugh she had been collecting since November, the one he produced when she caught him off guard, and she thought she would never get tired of it. The doctor confirmed it in the second week of August. She was careful through the fall, not restrictive, because she was not a woman built for restriction, but thoughtful. She trained a girl from the town of Dillard Crossing, a 16-year-old named Mabel Pritchard, to help in the cookhouse, teaching her with the same precise seriousness she brought to everything, and Mabel proved to be quick and willing and surprisingly talented. Clarence hovered. Not intrusively, but he was always slightly more present than he had been before, appearing in doorways to see if she needed things, riding back from the pastures earlier than necessary, leaving the ledger open on the dining table in the evenings rather than in his study, so that they could sit together while she did the accounts and he read. Elroy Pitch had appointed himself her unofficial protector during this period with the grave seriousness of a man who had decided this was his contribution to the situation and intended to make it count. He appeared at the cookhouse door 3 times a day to check on the wood supply, and on 2 occasions had carried things that she was perfectly capable of carrying herself, accepting her mild protests with serene indifference. She was too fond of him to be seriously annoyed. In March of 1885, she delivered a boy. The doctor from Dillard Crossing attended, a competent, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Helena Vance, who had been practicing on the frontier for 15 years and who treated childbirth with the combined efficiency of a professional and the warmth of someone who genuinely loved her work. Clarence was in the front room when the boy was born. Esther could hear him through the bedroom door, not pacing exactly, but not still either, moving with the restrained agitation of a man who was making himself stay out of the way and finding it the hardest thing he had ever done. When Dr. Vance brought him in, the boy was pink and irritable and extremely loud, which the doctor said was an excellent sign. Clarence sat on the edge of the bed beside Esther and looked at the baby with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was not the precise, contained steadiness she associated with him. It was something open and a little overwhelmed, like a man standing at the edge of something larger than he had words for. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your forehead." "He looks like a very small, very annoyed person," Clarence said, but his voice was rough. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. He had thought about it, she knew. She had heard him thinking about it in the particular silences of the last several months. "William," he said, "after my father, if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. "William Rourke." "William James Rourke," he said. "James for your father." She looked up at him. He had remembered her father's name from a single conversation in early November, months ago, spoken once without emphasis. "Yes," she said softly. "William James Rourke." William James Rourke was a serious baby who grew into a serious toddler with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and an opinion about everything that made both his parents laugh more often than they had expected. He walked at 11 months, which Dr. Vance said was ahead of schedule. He spoke his first clear word at 13 months, which was not mama or papa but the word hot, delivered with great urgency while pointing at the cookhouse range, a priority that Esther found entirely logical. The double R prospered through 1885 and into 1886. The railroad came through as predicted, and the water arrangement held, and the cattle prices recovered sufficiently to make the previous year's worry feel like a test they had passed. Clarence hired 2 more hands and built an extension onto the stable, and Esther planted an orchard, 12 trees in the spring of 1886, peach and apple, and a pair of pear trees that she was told might not take but planted anyway. The peach trees took. Mabel Pritchard had by this point become a full fixture of the ranch household, no longer just a cookhouse helper, but something close to a younger sister to Esther, someone to share the domestic work and the long conversations of afternoons. Mabel was bright and had ambitions toward school teaching that Esther encouraged actively, suggesting books from Clarence's shelves and quizzing her on mathematics and grammar with the focused attention of a woman who was determined that the people around her should have the opportunities she had been denied. "You should open a school," Mabel said one afternoon in the fall of 1886, while they were putting up the season's apple preserves. "In Dillard Crossing, they do not have a proper schoolhouse." "I have a ranch to run," Esther said. "You run the ranch and cook and keep the books," Mabel said with the accurate bluntness of someone who had been paying attention. "You could add a school." Esther looked at her jar of preserves. "I will think about it," she said. She mentioned it to Clarence that evening, expecting him to point out the practical difficulties, of which there were several. Instead, he looked at her with the assessing, interested expression she associated with him encountering a good idea. "The circuit school has been inconsistent," he said. The county needs something permanent. I was not seriously proposing it, she said. I know, he said, but you should be. She looked at him. You could do it, he said simply. You know that. She thought about her father, who had believed with his whole heart that the faithful were rewarded. Perhaps he had not been entirely wrong. Perhaps reward looked different than he had imagined. I would need a building, she said. That is a construction problem, he said, in the tone of someone who solved construction problems regularly. Not a reason not to. The Dillard Crossing Community School, such as it was, opened in September of 1887 in a one-room building on the east side of town that Clarence had organized the construction of over the preceding winter, with donated labor from 3 neighboring ranches and lumber that had come in on the new railroad. Esther taught 4 days a week, 12 students ranging from 6 to 14, in the same direct, precise manner with which she approached everything else she had ever done. Mabel Pritchard was her assistant and primary substitute, and by the following year had taken over the school almost entirely, while Esther, who was expecting again by the summer of 1888, managed the transition with the satisfaction of someone who had built something that could stand on its own. The second child, a girl, arrived in November of 1888. They named her Clara, after Clarence's mother, and she was from her earliest days the opposite of her brother in every particular, loud where William was quiet, social where he was contemplative, endlessly curious where he was carefully deliberate. She had Esther's dark hair and Clarence's eyes, a combination that produced a child of startling prettiness who seemed entirely unaware of it. William, by this point 3 years old and very much a person with opinions, greeted his sister with a measured assessment that eventually resolved into a proprietary affection. He was seen, on more than one occasion, standing beside her cradle with his small arms crossed, and an expression of alert guardianship that made everyone in the household resist the urge to laugh. The Double R had by 1889 become something that could hardly be called a simple cattle ranch, though it was still that at its core. It was a household with a school attached, an accounting operation, an orchard, a large productive garden, 7 ranch hands who had become something close to a community, and 2 children who were growing up with the specific freedom of the frontier, tempered by the specific discipline of 2 parents who took child-rearing as seriously as they took everything else. Elroy Pitch retired from active ranch work in the winter of 1889, his joints making the outdoor work impractical, and he had settled into a modified role that primarily consisted of supervising the younger hands with the authority of 11+ years of tenure, and keeping the harness room in perfect order, which was, everyone agreed, where his talents had always truly lain. He ate supper at the main house table now, had for over a year, because Esther had simply set a place for him one evening, and he had sat down with the dignity of a man accepting something he had been wanting to accept for a long time. There were 9 places set at the long oak table most evenings by 1889. Esther and Clarence at each end, William and Clara in their appropriate places, Elroy, Mabel on the evenings she stayed late, Dr. Vance when she stopped by, a neighboring rancher and his wife who had become genuine friends over the years, and occasionally one of the hands who had distinguished himself by some particular usefulness or was dealing with some particular hardship. The table that had once held 1 plate, 1 fork, 1 knife, and a man reading alone was now the center of something. On a spring evening in April of 1890, 7 years to the month after Esther had first ridden down the Pecos Road toward the Double R, she was standing at the cookhouse range and teaching William, who was 5, and had decided that cooking was interesting, how to stir a pot without scalding himself. Clara was in the garden eating dirt in the creative but non-alarming way of 2-year-olds under supervision. The smell of the peach trees in bloom drifted through the open cookhouse door. Clarence appeared in the doorway. He looked at William, who looked up from the pot with a serious expression and said, "I am stirring," as if this required no further elaboration. "So I see," Clarence said. He looked at Esther. She looked back at him. There was something in his expression, the particular quiet that meant he was thinking about something that mattered. "Come outside a moment," he said. "Mabel is in the kitchen. She can watch him." She wiped her hands on her apron and came out into the warm April air. The orchard was in full bloom, the 12 trees she had planted in 1886 now tall and heavy with blossoms, the peach trees best of all. The hills were green from the spring rains, a green that only lasted a few weeks before the summer turned them gold and dry. And the sky was the particular blue of West Texas that she had come to love with the irrational intensity of belonging. Clarence stood beside her at the edge of the orchard looking at the blooming trees. "7 years ago," he said, "you rode up to my door and told me you could cook better than anyone I was likely to find." "I was right," she said. "You were," he agreed, and she heard the smile in his voice without looking at him. "I have been trying to think," he said, "of the right thing to say, about what these years have been. And I do not have the right words because I have never been very good at the kind of words that are supposed to carry the big things." She turned and looked at him. "So I will just say," he continued, "that I hired you to cook, and then I spent the next several months finding every possible reason to sit at the same table as you, and I have not been sorry about any of it, not for one day." She was quiet for a moment. The peach blossoms moved in the light spring wind. "Neither have I," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, a small, habitual gesture he had developed over years of her being within reach, and she leaned her head slightly into his hand for a moment, the way she did when she was allowing herself to be simply still. "There is something else," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "I spoke to Dr. Vance last month," he said. "She mentioned when I asked that there was a family in Dillard Crossing, a widow with 2 young children. Her husband was one of the men killed in the county border dispute last fall. She is in a very difficult situation." Esther was quiet, listening. "I thought," he said carefully, "that if you were willing we might speak to her. There is room here. Mabel has suggested the idea herself separately." She looked at him. "You are suggesting we offer her a place here?" "Or help of another kind if that is what is needed," he said. "I would not decide without you, but I wanted to ask." She thought about a woman traveling alone with a carpet bag, looking at a notice nailed to a post at a general store. She thought about the words, "References preferred but not required if the work speaks for itself." "Yes," she said, "we should go and speak to her." He nodded, satisfied. From inside the cookhouse, William's voice rose in announcement. "I did not spill it." Both of them turned back toward the cookhouse. "That is a low bar," Esther called back. "He is 5, Clarence said, and put his hand at the small of her back as they walked together through the orchard toward the house. The woman in Dillard Crossing was named Ruth Hensley. She was 29 years old, with 2 boys aged 4 and 6, and a quality of quiet, exhausted dignity that Esther recognized in the particular way you recognize something you have been yourself. Ruth came to the Double R in May of 1890, initially to help with the school and the household in exchange for room and keep, and she proved to be capable and steady and deeply grateful in the way that has nothing to do with servility and everything to do with genuine relief. By the end of the summer, Ruth's boys, Thomas and Daniel, were running the ranch yard with William in a 3-person operation of general small chaos that kept Elroy Pitch occupied in a way that was good for him. And Clara had appointed herself their supervisor with the 2-year-old's complete confidence in her own authority. The table at the main house had expanded again. Clarence had added 2 more leaves to the long oak dining table, and it now seated 14 on ordinary evenings, and more when the neighboring families came. In the fall of 1890, Ruth Hensley met the new pastor of the Dillard Crossing Methodist Church, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Aldous Price, who had come to the county with his own quiet grief and his own quality of patient steadiness. Esther watched this develop with the particular attention of someone who had been through it herself and understood the specific geography of 2 careful people finding their way toward each other. She did not interfere, but she made sure that the Reverend was invited to Sunday supper regularly. By December, he was coming every Sunday. By March of 1891, he had spoken to Ruth. Esther stood with Ruth in the orchard on the afternoon the question was asked and answered, and Ruth's composure was entirely intact except for her eyes, which were doing something that Esther fully understood. "Is it possible," Ruth said carefully, "to love someone without feeling like you are replacing what you had before?" "Yes," Esther said without hesitation. "It is entirely possible. You are not replacing anything. You are adding." Ruth was quiet, looking at the hills. "He is a good man," Esther said. "I know," Ruth said. "That is the part that frightens me." Esther thought about a gray-green pair of eyes in a doorway, about a table with one plate and one fork, about a hand held out in professional greeting that had held her 7 years later at the edge of a blooming orchard. "Good men are not something to be frightened of," she said. "Being without them, that is the thing to be frightened of. The good ones are safe." Ruth married Reverend Aldous Price in June of 1891, in the same Dillard Crossing church where Esther and Clarence had stood 7 years earlier, with all the children present and Elroy Pitch in his best shirt and Dr. Vance in an extraordinary hat that she had ordered from somewhere and had clearly been saving for an occasion. The main house table was full that evening, 14 people around the oak table with its 2 added leaves, every candle in the house lit, every jar of Esther's best preserves on the table, Mabel's teaching salary supplemented by the teaching she had done going directly into the school building fund in town, and William James Rourke, 6 years old and as serious as ever, had made an attempt to help with the cornbread that had produced a result that everyone ate with sincere compliments and only a little private difficulty. It was July of 1892 that Esther confirmed she was expecting again. Their third. The previous year's suspicion had not come to the right conclusion, a loss that had been quiet and painful, and that she and Clarence had moved through together in the way they moved through everything, side by side, neither of them pretending it away or making it larger than they could bear. This pregnancy was steady and good. Dr. Vance visited monthly, satisfied and encouraging. William was 7 and Clara was 3, and they received the news with responses that precisely reflected their personalities. William asked several considered questions about logistics, and Clara announced that she wanted a sister and that her name would be Peach because of the trees, and that this was final. The baby arrived in February of 1893, another boy. They named him Daniel after Ruth's older boy, with whom he would share a name and would eventually share a very long friendship, and his unofficial first name, in the informal accounting of the household, was known from the start as Peach, because Clara decreed it and Clara at 4 was not negotiable. He was called Daniel officially and Peach by everyone who loved him, and later in life he said he considered this an entirely satisfactory arrangement. The Double R Ranch stood for decades after that first October day in 1883, when Esther Covington had ridden up to a limestone house and knocked on the front door with her mother's iron skillet in her carpet bag, and a history she was still learning how to tell. The orchard Esther had planted grew tall and productive, the peach trees best of all, and she made preserves from them every fall that tasted, everyone said, like the best version of summer. The school in Dillard Crossing grew from 1 room to 3, then eventually into a proper county schoolhouse. Mabel Pritchard taught there for 30 years. Elroy Pitch died in the winter of 1895, peacefully and with his harness room in perfect order, and he was buried on the ranch he had served for more than 20 years, because there was nowhere else that would have suited him and everyone knew it. The table at the main house remained large. Children grew up around it and brought their own children back to it. William James Rourke grew into the same careful, competent man his father was, with his mother's head for figures and his father's feeling for the land. Clara grew into a woman of such formidable confidence and warmth that people said she had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet, but both of those things were simply wrong. She was entirely herself, always had been. Daniel, called Peach, grew into a laughing, easy man who loved the ranch and loved his family and ran the orchard in his adult years with a genuine passion that made his mother think of her father preaching with his whole body. On an evening in the spring of 1900, 17 years from the day she had first arrived at the Double R, Esther Covington Rourke stood at the long oak table and set the places for supper. She did not count how many. It did not matter exactly. Whatever the number, there was always room. Clarence came in from the back of the house and stood in the doorway of the dining room watching her set the table with the same attention he had given her since the very beginning when she had walked into his cookhouse and turned what was available into something remarkable. She looked up and found him there. "You are staring," she said. "I am looking," he said. "There is a distinction." She set down the last fork. "And what are you looking at?" He crossed the room to the table. He pulled out her chair. Not the chair assigned to the cook, not the chair at the working end of the table. The chair at the right hand of the head where she had sat every evening for 17 years, the place that was hers in every way that mattered. "I am looking at my wife," he said, "who came to my door with a carpet bag and a skillet and a dignity that put me in my place from the first sentence, and who has been at this table ever since, and who has made everything, absolutely everything, better than it was before." She sat in her chair. She looked at the table around them, this table that had once held one plate and one fork and one man eating alone. "You saved me a seat," she said softly, the same words she had thought years ago but had never quite said aloud. "I saved you the seat," he said, "every evening, from the moment I understood what I was doing." He sat down beside her at the head of the table. Outside, somewhere in the yard, Clara and William were arguing about something with the comfortable intensity of siblings who have argued comfortably their whole lives, and Daniel's voice cut across them with the cheerful authority of the youngest who knows he is the favorite. And the peach trees in the orchard were white with spring blossoms, and the hills of West Texas were green in the last weeks before the summer turned them gold. Inside, at the long oak table with the candles just lit, Clarence Rourke reached across and covered his wife's hand with his, and Esther Covington Rourke looked at him with the steady, wide-open certainty of a woman who had finally, fully, come home. The supper bell rang. The house filled with voices. The table filled with people. And Esther thought that the best version of her life had begun the moment she had answered a notice nailed to a post at a general store, and had ridden down a dry October road toward a limestone house and a man who would hire her to cook, and then, slowly and absolutely, find in her the center of his entire world. She had come to work. He had given her a place. And every evening since, without fail, without question, there was a chair pulled out at that long oak table waiting for her, and she sat in it, and everything was well.